Hi, I'm Larry Puckett, the DCC guy. Today I want to go ahead and follow up on that first video I did on speakers by showing you something about how speakers work and then how to wire them up properly so you get the best sound from them. And there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And if you get it wrong, like I said, your speaker installation could be a dud. Okay, before we move on, I do want to go back over one thing that I forgot to mention in the introductory video on speakers, and that was this particular type of speaker here. Now you can see, compared to a standard 1-inch round speaker and a 11 by 15 sugar cube speaker, you can see that it's about 3 times the length of this sugar cube speaker. But it's about half the thickness. So it's going to fit in a lot of diesel hood units, that type of thing, where you don't have as much overhead space as you might have for the standard size of sugar cube speaker, or obviously for that round speaker. Now, as I said, these are an iPhone speaker. They're specifically for an iPhone 4. And you can find these all over eBay for sale, and they're generally a very good speaker. I have seen comparisons between these speakers and these sugar cubes, and there's essentially no difference in the waveforms and output across a nice range of frequencies. So these are a pretty nice one. I will have a follow-up video just on using these speakers, and so we'll get into a little bit more depth on these iPhone speakers later on, but they're a nice option. As you can see from this diagram, speakers are basically fairly simple devices. I used this diagram in an article in Model Railroader back in May of 2016, and as you can see, the typical speaker is comprised of a diaphragm or a cone, and it vibrates in and out, creating the sound waves that we hear. If you then look here, this particular coil of wire is attached to the diaphragm, and it acts as an electromagnet. And basically you get varying DC current pulses coming in through these 2 wires from the device producing the sound, and then that electrifies this coil with those on-off pulses, and this coil then becomes an electromagnet. And you'll notice behind the coil and the diaphragm we have this permanent magnet. So what happens is, every time we get an on pulse of current coming from the decoder, it turns on this electromagnet, and it's repulsed from the permanent magnet, pushing the diaphragm outward, and that creates the sound waves. Okay, now that's pretty straightforward. The other thing about this is, though, as I said, these pulses are an on-off sequence. Okay, so you get current on and current off. When it's on, it pushes that out this way. But then when the pulse turns off, the cone moves back to the left here into its resting position. And the interesting thing is that when this cone moves back, it pushes another set of sound waves out the backside of the speaker. So you're creating 2 basically mirror image sound waves, one out the front and then one out the back. And also, this sound wave here, the first one created, is slightly ahead of the one that is created out of the back of the cone. Okay? So they are slightly out of phase. Now, as any good Star Trek fan will tell you, when any 2 things that are out of phase come into contact with one another, it's really not a good thing. And in this case, if the forward and the back sound waves come into contact, on the way to your ear, they will cancel each other out, and you will hear very little, if anything, at all. So that's why it's very important to use enclosures like those that I showed you in the introductory video. It keeps these two sound waves apart. Basically, you've got a box behind this speaker, and it captures all of the sound wave and prevents it from interfering with this main sound wave that you want to hear. Also, it's very important that you get an airtight seal between the speaker and the enclosure that it's being installed onto. I usually use a gel type super glue, and then after that dries, I will then come around with a toothpick and more of the glue and basically paint it on around that gap between the speaker and the diaphragm box. And that way it gives you a really good airtight seal so that none of this wave actually gets out and interferes. Now also, as I mentioned, I think the other day when I was showing you the enclosures, you can actually install these speakers in with the cone facing out or with it facing into the enclosure. And that is simply because the sound wave that is produced out the back is identical to the one produced out the front, and therefore you can hear either one of them as long as they both are not allowed to propagate. So it's very important to be able to do this and seal up that speaker one side or the other so the two sound waves do not interfere with one another. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at wiring and what happens with wiring. Okay, there's three ways, and multiples of these actually once you combine them, to wire your speakers to get the best sound out. You can wire them in parallel, you can wire them in series as shown here, and then you can mix with series and parallel wiring. So let's take a look at each, and I'll give you a little bit of tips on doing this. Now the important thing in each case here is to be able to distinguish between the positive and the negative terminals on your speakers. Some speakers actually do have markings on them next to the speaker solder contacts, but many anymore do not. And I've never seen anything on a sugar cube speaker, for example. That makes it a little difficult to know what is positive and what's negative. And in reality, it doesn't matter whether the speaker is wired true, positive, and negative, as long as when you're doing two of them, you are consistent. Because, as I showed you in the previous diagram on speaker construction and the like, depending on whether or not you're hooking up positive to positive and negative to negative, the coil is going to move either out away from the permanent magnet or it will be drawn towards it. Okay? So, and since a sound wave is produced either direction, it doesn't really matter then whether the cone is moving in or out, but it does matter if you have two of them if you are consistent. You cannot have one set up so that your coil is moving in when it's hitting an on cycle, and the other one where it's moving out, because that way you'll get the two separate sound waves, one from the forward and one from the back, and they'll cancel each other out. So it's important then that you be consistent. It's not all that important that you know exactly which terminal or contact is positive and which is negative. Okay, and I'll show you in a few minutes how to go about testing a speaker to find out which is positive and negative. Okay, so what we've got here then for parallel wiring, and this is one of the oddball things. Most of the speakers that are made for use with decoders today are 8 ohm, 1 watt, or 2 watt speakers. And the wattage is important because a lot of decoders put out 1 watt. Their amplifiers are set for 1 watt of output. But there are some, like the Economy plug-and-play decoder, that is rated at 2 watts. Now, if you put a 1 watt speaker in with a 2-watt output and you pump that volume up to full volume, you're going to be pumping potentially 2 watts through your speaker. And you don't want to do that because you will burn it out. You will blow that sucker. And in a lot of my articles and videos that I've done and the like, I really warn people about this, that you need to be aware of the wattage of the speaker and adjust the master volume setting accordingly. If you have a speaker that is rated at 0.5 watt and you're putting it in with a 1-watt decoder, then you should set that speaker master or the output master volume at about 50% of total. So somewhere, typically, most of these you'll go up to a 255. You would want to set it somewhere around 126, 127. And that way, with the master volume halved, you should not get more than about 0.5 watt of output from that 1-watt decoder. So be very careful about that. Now, what about the ohms here? Well, the good thing is, even though most decoders are rated at 8 ohms, and most speakers produced for them are rated at 8 ohms, they can usually work anywhere from about 4 ohms to 16 ohms. So you're probably safe no matter which way you go there, which is a good thing, because if you're doing parallel wiring, as shown here, because of electronics, and I'll let you visit some of the websites on the internet that explain speakers and this kind of thing. If you have 2 8-ohm speakers and you wire them in parallel, they will only put out or be rated at 4 ohms. They have because of the parallel wiring. Now, on the other hand, with series speakers, you can see that the wires are connected between the 2 speakers this way, with the plus to the minus between the 2 contacts. Because they are wired this way, and again, because of electronics, these 2 add. So 2 8-ohm speakers wired in series will give you 16 ohms. Also, they might have a little slightly lower sound volume output with this type of setup than you might see with the parallel wiring. But to be honest with you, I have never really noticed it to be that significant, and most decoders that are produced these days are so loud that you're going to have to turn them down anyway. That's just my take on it. I always, just about always, cut my volume in half, even, if I'm using a 1-watt speaker and a 1-watt decoder, because the sound that these things can put out is just amazing anymore. Now, one of the interesting things is if you go ahead and mix the series and parallel wiring as shown in this diagram, it uses both of these approaches. So you get 2 of these wired in series is 16 ohms, but then because those are wired in parallel, they're halved, so it's 8 ohms again. So that's one way to use 4 speakers. I don't know anybody that does that, but it's just an interesting sidelight that you'll often see in these diagrams, is that you can actually wire up 4 speakers and still only be drawing 8 ohms to this group of speakers. So the important thing then is, the take home on this is, do your wiring, be consistent, get the polarities at least correct for the 2 speakers. It doesn't matter if they're plus or minus, as long as you're consistent with minus to minus and plus to plus. One other thing that, to take home out of this is the wattage settings for the decoders. Typically, the sugar cube speakers are rated often at 0.7 to 0.8 ohms, so you need to adjust that down accordingly. And I usually mention this in articles when I do a sugar cube installation, and very often you'll want to downrate that master volume output so that you're not overdriving those speakers. And one thing, if you have your speakers installed and you hear a crackling sound, you need to immediately immediately take that locomotive off the truck and reprogram that master volume, because you will blow out that coil in the speaker. I've done it myself one time, and in that case it didn't blow out the coil, it overdrove the amplifier and burned out the amplifier. And I had to send it back to Soundtrax, and fortunately they were able to replace the amplifier. But you know, if you hear any crackling sounds from a speaker, immediately get it off the truck and adjust that master volume. Get your volumes down. And you know, that should not be happening. It's called clipping typically, and it's caused because you're trying to overdrive the amplifier and get more sound out than you really can for the configuration of the speakers and wiring that you've chosen to do. Very often it's because you've got an inadequate enclosure seal, so you need to go back and check that as well. So those are some of the tips I have for you. I typically use series wiring simply because it's easier on the decoder to go with 16 than it is to go with 4 ohms. It just works a lot cooler with this particular setup than it does with the parallel wiring. The only place that I use parallel wiring is if I want one speaker to be located in the lead locomotive and a second speaker to be located in a B unit, for example, or a locomotive that only has a mobile-only decoder. And then I can go ahead, install one speaker in each, and then just put a connector on these two wires, and I can connect and disconnect the two locomotives whenever I want to. Okay, let's go ahead and move on, and I'll show you how you can use a simple battery trick to check the polarity of speakers. If you look here in the center, you'll see this copper-colored wire coil here. Okay, that's the voice coil, the electromagnet that causes this speaker cone, and this is the cone here. It's kind of hard to see because it's made out of, you know, clear plastic, but it's there, and that cone right there is attached to the back, or the coil is attached to the back of that cone. Okay, I've got a couple of AA batteries here in a holder, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you what it looks like when you electrify that coil just using a battery. So watch closely. You'll mainly see the coil move out away from the permanent magnet in the back there. Well, you can probably see the movement, but there you can see it moving up and down. And that's because I'm touching the positive wire to the positive contact on the back of the speaker. So that's the easy way to tell with these round speakers, or most speakers anyway. Now with these daggone sugar cube speakers, it's a little bit more difficult. You can see some movement. Some of them, however, they're sealed and you can't see anything. So your best bet is, like I said, use 2 of the same manufacturer and just assume, and you can almost be guaranteed, that if this is positive and that's negative on one, it'll be the same on a second one. So that's the easy way to check these. There's no really easy way to check the sugar cube speakers. However, you know, you can wire them up on your bench top and hook them up to an extra sound decoder and see how they sound. If they produce sound well together, then that's an indication that you've got them properly oriented. Well, that pretty much wraps it up for this series of videos on speakers. I hope that gives you a better perspective on how to go about installing them so that you get the best sound and volume possible from these, because you know you've put a good investment into your locomotives and the decoders that go with them. So go ahead, put the extra effort into getting the best sound that you can by using the best speakers and getting them installed properly.